Hey team, welcome to a really special episode of the Intentional Agribusiness Leader Podcast. This is your host, Mark Jewell, and today I'm in Decatur, Alabama. My first time to Alabama today, crossing
Welcome
the border.
Alabama.
I'm with Jeff Blair, the CEO at GreenPoint Ag, and Joey Caldwell, what do you say, Executive Vice President?
Yes, senior.
Senior Vice President, okay. And
Senior's probably more applicable.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to have a conversation around intentional leadership with you guys. So thanks for making the time. I appreciate you opening up your space and let me come in here and actually sit down face to face. We don't get to do enough of these.
No, appreciate it. Excited to have you here, and welcome to Alabama.
All right. Thank you much. I'm going to kick it off. Both of you get this one. And Jeff, I'll have you go first. What's it mean for you to be intentional?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think for me, when I think of it, the best word I come to is deliberate. Mm-hmm. That there's a really being thoughtful about how you go about whatever it is you're doing. Whether you think about as a leader how I show up, or if we're building a culture, how we build culture. Mm-hmm. It's recognizing that good teams, strong teams, they don't happen by accident. Mm-hmm. That sometimes I suppose they do, but so do bad ones. But being very deliberate about it, being very intentional about how you grow a team and develop a team and maintain a team, to me is very, you want to be deliberate and thoughtful about it with some planning.
Yeah. I want to come back and go deeper on that one, but Joey, talk a little bit. What's your take on
Yeah, I mean, I love the word deliberate. That's first comes to mind. I'd add purpose, thinking about a sense of purpose. And then when I think about intentional, you're talking about defining goals, objectives. Mm-hmm. And then, the other part of that is about, how do you keep score?
Mm. Yeah, that's actually a really good point. I'm glad you brought that up. Because I think it segues to where I want to go with this next, which is, you're running a fairly sizable organization here. You got to be over 1,000 people.
Yeah, we're, depending on in season we grow a little bit with temps, but we're around 1,100 people across 10 states, 120 locations, give or take.
Yeah, so being deliberate from your end of the organization might mean something different sometimes at another end if it's not purposeful, well executed, those kind of things. So how do you, when you're being deliberate, how do you make sure that gets communicated all the way through and that it means something?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, this is the absolute trickiest part of doing things at scale. Mm-hmm. We were talking obviously a little before we hit the record button here, and there's a bunch of things you can do one-on-one, or if you have a team that you can sort of literally physically reach out and touch. Mm-hmm. But if you're now influencing somebody else's on your team so that they can influence their team, and in Joey's instance, not only is he influencing their team, it's them influencing their teams. It's several layers in the organization, and getting everybody to buy in. That is a very, very tricky thing. I wish I could say there's some pithy 30-second answer, but the answer is it's brutally difficult. I think it takes intentionality. Mm-hmm. You have to be very, very deliberate about what you do and how you go about doing it, and it takes time. That you've got to get that next level buying in. They've got to buy in, then they've got to do the development. They've got to sort of, in some sense, I hate to say it, feel the pressure of what we're trying to accomplish, and then they're going to turn around and sort of have their teams do it. I don't know. I think for me it's a series of steps along the way. Mm-hmm. We're very much, I would say we're 3.5 years into our journey and very much still at the early stages of it, in my view. I don't know what yours is.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think, Jeff and I talk about leadership. Mm-hmm. And we have, I think we do share a lot of thoughts in common about that. But this concept or idea to do it to scale is proven to be much more than sort of a bargain for. That's when you get into, I think, and we may talk about these things, it's when you get into purpose, you get into culture, and I think the greatest challenge for me is to understand you have to build a culture of leadership. In other words, you have to have individuals at each layer of the business understand that you are a leader. Mm-hmm. And that's been kind of tough for us. Mm-hmm. We think in terms of managers, we take, so individuals have their roles. I think we've struggled a little bit in understanding, okay, this is your role, but it requires you to be a leader in that role. Mm. And that's it's been a bit of a challenge for us.
Is it a challenge getting people to step up and really assume and own the
I think-
role of leader?
I don't know that assume the role. I think it's in some cases to understand better
Yeah.
what that really requires of you.
I think that's right. I think it's one thing to say, okay, I'm in charge. The first time you ever get a job, okay, I'm the manager. What do I get? You sort of think about, I get more pay, and I get there's an analysis of sort of the things I get or whatever it is, right? The title, and then all of a sudden it suddenly dawns on you if you're really focusing on servant leadership, like there's a level of responsibility that comes, and that is accepting that. It's a difference between, hey, I'm in charge and I'm a leader, and that acceptance of understanding what that means on an impactful level for yourself and for your team. I think for us, it's been a journey just to help people sort of understand that and what our expectations are, but also for them to sort of, embody it. To sort of accept it, right? To carry the mantle.
Yeah. When we do people developing, we always look at taking every one of our clients from a state of awareness, that's the training. When you go through training, it's like, oh, this is what I'm okay at. This is what I'm terrible at. These are but we have to make them aware from awareness to embodiment.
Yeah.
And it's not like you just put somebody in a manager role and you flip on to go from awareness to embodiment in a day.
Well, yeah, and in some sense, leadership is both an art and a science, right? And so going back to your question about intentional, you study the science of it and thinking about it, and you have to accept it. To begin to do that, you have to start accepting yourself as the leader. What do they say? The 4 phases of learning, right? Is the first stage is unconsciously incompetent. Right? You don't know you suck, right? The second stage is consciously incompetent. Okay, I know I've got some things I got to work on. Third, then you go consciously competent, and then ultimately you're just doing it as a matter of habit, which is that unconsciously competent. And I think we got to take people along those journeys, but the first step is, to your point, is being conscious of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's talk a little bit about where you find enough people to man a facility. I know it's not one facility, but I mean, you're talking 1,100 people in a very rural part of America. I look at your map on the wall back over here. I don't know if people can see that on the video, but I mean, there's a lot of geography, guys. What is that? 8 states?
10.
We're across 10 states.
Wow,
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
You want to tackle this one, Jim?
Yeah, I mean, I can, and you sort of hit on it. One of those challenges is we're in these rural communities, and let's face it, this is not unique to the South. And we could go down another whole rabbit hole here, but the health of our rural communities is a challenge, and retaining just retain individuals in the community long enough to recruit is a bit of a challenge. So there are a lot of things that we've done, I'd say, that are important for retention, but they become important for recruitment. And it's back to deliberate, defining career path, succession planning. There are just some of those things that we do internally that sort of give a pathway. We could even talk as simple as we start with a truck driver.
Sure.
Even as a truck driver, there's a pathway here for you to continue to engage within the organization. And then
culture.
developing culture. And I think maybe we'll talk about that a little more. But, and part of culture is a sense of purpose, mission, shared values. There are a lot of things there that are important. And then we can get into generational discussions that also matters.
In my mind, people, I remember back in my days in the military, this general stands up and he talks about some RAND study, which I'm sure the government paid trillions of dollars for, right? But he says, soldiers stay in the Army for 2 reasons, right? They feel like they're a valued member of the team and that their commander has their back. And I'm sitting there as a young officer in the back, and I'm like, "Hey, that's me too. That's what I want. I want to be part of something. I want to belong to something. I want to feel like I'm part of a team that matters, and I want to feel like my boss has got my back. Whoever my manager's got my back. And I think so. If you start there and reckon, going back to your point about leadership, that I think if you've got managers who sort of see that and are trying to drive to that on the teams, and we've got a lot of really strong leaders in this company, those local those local leaders, those site managers are the sort of the
Yeah.
critical link in our business.
Yeah.
And where we've got really strong ones, we've got incredible teams, incredible cultures, and they do well. And then you've got other ones that may be struggling, right? And
Yeah.
because there are little islands out there, how do we support that? And I think the third part, Joey, you mentioned it, is around what's my career. We've done a lot of work around helping people understand what the path to grow is. So once you're happy where you are, what's my path? How do I progress in this career
Yeah.
if I want to?
Of
Right?
course.
I mean, some people may, some people won't, but we've done it. We've been very intentional about it.
That's good. So as you look across the organization as a whole, is it one culture you're trying to drive down? Are you retaining local cultures at individual locations? Anytime you've consolidated
Yeah.
this many organizations under one roof, you have tribal cultures that are obviously coming into play in different regions. So I'm curious how that.
I guess I'll take that first one. Yeah, I'm going to say the answer to your question is yes.
Yeah.
And, right? Which is, look, there's no question that each local area is going to have its own culture.
Yeah,
Right? Because
right.
it's a team. And that team is going to usually over time reflect that culture that leader is helping to develop. Right? The second one, though, is I always say we are a team of teams. So what's the larger GreenPoint culture? And for us, and I'm holding up my little book, but we put together what we call the culture playbook.
Okay.
And again, it was a very deliberate attempt to say, who are we? What do we stand for? What are the values we stand for? What are the things that if you don't sort of follow along, I always say, if you read this book when we're recruiting people and you're like, yeah, this sounds weird, we're probably not your people. Right? And,
Yeah, I can get along with that. I like that.
right. You just, hey, does this sound like the kind of place you'd want to work? So we do want to have that overall sort of GreenPoint culture. I would say when we started, it was, the cultures were similar but distinct, right? There obviously agriculture has a common culture. Southern culture is common. I was a bit of more of the outsider sort of coming in here.
Sure.
But there's still a blue collar sort of grinded, salt of the earth work ethic that sort of embodies, I think, everybody.
Yep.
That's fun for me to be part of. I don't know if you have a better answer.
Well, I mean, it's both.
Yeah.
I mean, there's value in that local sort of execution within those cultures, and they are different. We even you think, well, the South is the South. No, not really. It's very diverse across 10 states. But there's also the part where we want to be, from an operational standpoint, is to be better. What can we do alike and consistently and uniformly that can make us better? So it is both. And I'd say the local execution, we were pretty good. I'd say sort of the operational efficiency part, not so much.
Sure.
So that's been an area for us really to improve.
I would say inconsistent, right? In any organization, if you're not doing it through systems and processes, you've got some that are doing it really well. They figured it out. They got the secret sauce. Others that are really struggling. How do we make sure that is more consistent over time?
Yep.
And we're learning from those who are being successful and implement those.
Well, let's go back to the top of this thing on culture then, and I want to come back through mission, purpose, shared values, some of those things that are important. What's important at GreenPoint? What does that look like? What's the consistent message that you guys are trying to communicate? We'd love to start with that, and then maybe go a little bit more tactical with it. But whoever wants to take this, my question will be, what is that consistent message that's getting communicated? Is that an important thing? Would we find that throughout the organization at this point? Like, where are you at in that journey?
You want to go ahead?
Yeah, I mean,
I'll jump
will
in.
say that
Yeah.
you can, if you ask the two of us and we can't pass, we're in real trouble. But the real question is, if you head out to that truck driver out there,
Yeah, exactly. Right.
in Louisiana, South Louisiana, does he understand what our vision and our mission is? So from our perspective, from our vision is to be the premier provider of agronomy in the southern U.S.
Okay.
So we talk a lot about what it means to be premier, from a safety perspective,
Yep.
from a provider of choice. So from a customer, from an employee perspective, we want to be the employer of choice. I think being a valued member of our communities is really, really critical. And my view is if we're safe, if we take care of our customers, if we take care of our employees, and if we take care of our communities, and again, Joey, I think you would hit it. The rural America is in a tough spot right now, and so if we do those four things right, the profits will come.
Yeah.
And so we build that culture that we do those four things first. We obviously need to have a bottom line. This is a capital-intensive business, and we got to make money.
Yep.
And we do that. But our mission is really to help our growers and our co-ops succeed. It's real straightforward for us. And so we try to talk about that a lot. But I think it's fair to say one of the key lessons that I've learned over the last 3.5 years is boy, we talk about you got to say it 7 times 7 ways. That's probably way under.
Yep.
That if you're not very, very deliberate and talking about it all the time, it doesn't make it all the way down. There's just a lot of a filter.
Yeah, and I agree with all of that. My perspective is a little different in that we painted this picture, and a lot of that had to do with Jeff and helping to create that vision. From my perspective, I've lived all of those things, not with this overall vision, just over time, just to add the layers. And for me, even the sort of the community engagement, that was the final step. But it's like, okay, you've done these things pretty well, but maybe not doing this is intentional. So those things I came into more from just experience over time.
Sure.
They all matter. They're all important.
Yeah.
And they're especially even that part in these rural communities where they struggle in a lot of different ways. And you look and say, oh, we happen to be one of the largest employers in this particular community. And you look at the amount of commerce at agriculture, boy, if we're not engaged, who is?
Right. Wow. Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. I'll just share a little bit about my business, and one of the reasons that we continue to work in agribusiness, because there's nothing uniquely special about what Thrive Today does that we couldn't do in any industry. But in part, I came from ag. My degree's in ag ed. I grew up in rural Minnesota. I think this is where I feel like my people are from. But boy, like, leadership is so powerful. Right, and when you have good, well-trained leaders, people who are showing up as really what we call the next best version of themselves, if we can get into that person's mind and heart a little bit and help them want to show up better at any of these dots that you got up on your map over here, or any of our other customers across the country, like, there's something magical that starts to happen when that person is actually showing up present, fulfilled, as a leader in their role. Like, there's something really unique that happens. And it's night and day different if you go down the road to another company, or you just same company, another location that doesn't have that leader. Yeah. You just have people that are just sort of asleep at the wheel, unawake within the organization. So I'm passionate about creating that. I live in a rural county in North Carolina now, and you see, the upstream positive consequence of intentional leadership, and you see the negative downstream consequence, right, of unintentional or just lack of leadership.
Yeah. No, I don't think there's any question, and we are trying to figure out how to not only build that and then just down through the organization, support those guys who want to do that as much as we can, encourage those who need it otherwise, and obviously that self-awareness is a critical challenge. But for any, the difficulty is the ones who are struggling probably on the leadership side are struggling on the self-awareness side, because so that could be a challenge, right?
Yeah. Joey, I want to come back to something I made a note about earlier. It's measurement, right? I know you're a big measurement guy and measuring results. So when it comes to culture, talent development, retention, all those things, what kind of things are you looking for? What are you measuring inside the organization these days?
Gosh, yeah, you talk about how to keep score. That one's tough, because we're still a sales and service organization,
right?
So sometimes it's harder to measure the soft stuff. It's a lot easier to measure the hard stuff. So we have a tendency to measure that. Historically we looked at things like revenue, margins, those kind of things. For years ago, I started looking at the business from a standpoint of acres instead of sort of volume in acres, because those other things can be influenced by inflation, deflation, especially in our business. But the soft stuff is just, it's kind of hard. It's kind of, we put so much value on it. We put so much emphasis on it. So learning how to do that, it's not easy to do.
It's a tougher
I wished
story.
I could say I had it figured out.
Well, a couple things we try, right? Yep. So we use an engagement score. We do a third-party, pretty extensive survey. That a third party comes in. It's completely anonymous. Our goal is to try and get as much high as a participation as we can, north of 80%. So, and it's completely anonymous. I always say I really actually don't want to know who said what.
Right.
So we pay a lot of attention to it. And there's, it asks for feedback at the end. We had 400 and some odd comments last year.
Wow.
Some absolutely brutally honest. We don't, as leaders, it's actually pretty, it can be tough sledding.
Yep.
Those are not, we remember the ones that are tough. And again, we ask people for their feedback, but we take that very, very seriously. But we've had a very, very high engagement score.
Awesome.
So we won an award a year and a half ago for our engagement score for companies our size across the country.
Oh, wow.
Top 10%. So we're pretty proud of that.
Cool.
We track voluntary turnover a lot and closely, because obviously if you've got different if you've got your voluntary turnover moving and people are moving in the wrong direction. I've been part of companies where everybody's like, oh, well, that guy left for this reason and she left for this reason and he left. I'm like, hey, they all have one thing in common, which is whatever something else was better than where they are today.
Yep.
And we need to pay attention to that. So we pay that attention to that. And I'm proud to say that what we can, as best as we can measure, our voluntary turnover is about half of what we think of as the industry average.
Okay, that's great. Awesome.
And we've done, when we say premier provider, that we actually have metrics that we use to track that. These are our targets.
Oh, cool.
And those scores, those soft scores, are part of that. Of course, there's also some hard numbers in there that sometimes those can be tough. But when we say we want to be the premier provider of agronomy in the South, we actually do have metrics that
That's great. I love it. I'm a big fan of measuring on both ends, both the lagging as well as the leading. And in our programs, we generally focus more on the leading because I can't control the lagging. It's too late, right? I mean, we can look at last year's numbers and try to, but it takes a long time. There's a really interesting thing that's been coming up, and a trend just both amongst clients and with us personally, is a lot of times the leading things just aren't what we thought they were going to be. Right, it's this weird stuff. Like I've shared this example on the podcast before. You guys probably haven't heard it, but one of my daily protocols for Mark Jewell in his business is to text 5 people a day. Okay, I'm not asking for business. I'm not asking for an appointment. I'm just sending. Maybe I heard of something at church over the weekend, and I send that verse out, or maybe I saw a funny meme on Instagram, and I'm going to share that, or it just may be like, hey, Joey, great day to have a great day, get after it. Thought about you, and just when I do that, when I consistently follow through on that behavior, my pipeline
it just
stays full.
Yeah,
I'm not asking for anything, and these people often aren't the ones that become the customers. It's almost I almost can't correlate those people and the customer base. But when I'm just in the energy, the behavior of pouring into my network and building my network consistently, pipeline stays full. And then we know if it's in the pipeline, we're going to close 30% of that every year. So just put more in the pipeline, right? And but that's a leading indicator. And as soon as I get busy, get distracted, make the excuses, and I fall off, my pipeline goes dry. Within 60 days, it is telltale. Right, so that's one of the challenges: is how do we figure out what are those softer things that are harder to measure? I'm sure we can measure whether he texted 5 people a day or not.
No, but I do think you're right. I mean, finding the leading indicators and the ones that are actually going to lead to the outcomes you want is a very, very tricky thing, right?
Yep, absolutely. And then helping people follow through on those is the next level tricky thing. So good stuff. I want to talk a little bit more about you guys on the individual level. Talk about some big hurdles and some wins and things that you guys have had as leaders. You guys have storied backgrounds, and Joey, you've been in this for a long time. Jeff got military background and a great background in the ag industry. So I think you guys have a lot to share on this. Whoever wants to go first, you guys decide. You can flip a coin. But what's the biggest hurdle you've had to overcome as a leader?
So I'm gonna go back and myself is that's gonna be the biggest hurdle, and I can go back a long time. I tend to be a little more introverted in nature, and early on, and I'm going back to high school. I began to make a connection between leadership and popularity, or leadership and politics. Those two things were not very important to me. I didn't care. I didn't care that much about being popular, and I sure didn't care that much about politics.
Sure.
But there was one point where I was engaged, and I really engaged in FFA. That's where I learned a lot. And my advisor, mentor, one day said, I think you should run for a state office. I said, really? I was barely an officer in the local club because I just didn't care about running for an election because that seemed to me just to be a popularity contest. I wasn't interested in that. So I did. I got engaged. Boy, as I started kind of to prepare myself for that, I thought, this is really intriguing for me. And I go to the convention. I get elected to state president. I leave with with very little. I'm not really ambition. I'm sort of doing what my mentor had asked me to do. And all of a sudden, from there, things just started clicking. But I was in my own way because I just couldn't see myself. From there, leadership, became a little bit more of I'd say a calling. And I'm going to just fast forward. I went from what I thought was a really good understanding of what it meant to be a leader, and I got to be a boss. And when I got to be a boss, being boss sort of got in the way, and I sort of lost a little bit of that connection in, what does it mean to be a leader? I mean, that being vulnerable, being able to relate in a different way, and being able to think, okay, maybe I am I've got a lot of confidence, I got a lot of pride. Maybe at times I think I'm the smartest in the room. And I said, you know what? These folks really don't care. That's not, so when I began to connect with what's really important to them, that's when I felt like, so if you talk about low points maybe or challenges, that was a real challenge for me to make that transition, to understand, I could tell some stories where I almost had to get slapped in the face a few times.
Sure.
To understand, this is why this is not working like I had hoped it would.
Yeah.
And it's on me.
Wow. That fascinating background, fascinating answer to that. I loved it, actually. And I can relate to the FFA background, which FFA does a great, I wouldn't be here if it weren't for FFA. Hands down. Would not be doing what I do for a living. And there's a lot of theory as a student learner, right? There's a lot of theory in there. And then you get into the real world, and we almost need FFA again at about 30.
Yeah. No.
Yep.
So, yeah, it's good. Jeff, what about you?
Well, I'll give you two. The easy answer is myself, because I think anybody, and we go back to and partly why you do what you do is that for most of us, the hardest person to lead is ourselves. And so, you think you're doing a great job. You're learning these things, and you're doing. I read more than maybe I should, or other people certainly think I should. And you pick up on all these things, and the opportunity to put those into practice.
Yep.
But fundamentally, at some point, you're going to hit some wall. You're going to make some mistake if you're driving the car pretty hard. At some point, you end up in the ditch, and you realize that you were the one who was driving the car and that you put in the ditch.
Yep.
And how to figure out how to get yourself out of it. So that I've spent probably, I would say, a tremendous amount of time trying to, and it's going to be a lifelong work in progress. I think it's fair to say. I think
for all of us.
Yeah, from a practical perspective, I think putting this company together, I think in the middle of COVID, trying to bring 3 companies together across 120 locations was, looking back, you go, what, we were crazy.
Oh, yeah.
We were. But you just solve one problem to the next, and we added Tri-County Farmers Co-op and added, so in 2021 we added them, and it's been a heck of a journey, but I think trying to do that, and how do you build culture across a very dispersed organization in the middle of a pandemic where the physically getting together wasn't really possible for quite a long time.
Yeah. It was a massive challenge for our business. We definitely understood that being an event-focused company, not being able to run events, you can imagine how that went for us. So, but that's a big one. I mean, it's almost hard to get your head around what that must have been like. I'm just thinking the two of you guys sitting around here trying to figure out how do we get this thing to work together when we can't really get people together.
Right.
How do you drive change?
Well, and I think you got to, how do you drive together? How do you drive, going back to that deliberate? I mean, I think that was maybe one of the good news is, first, there's a little bit of grace that everybody gives because it was just a period of time where everybody sort of expectations were different.
Yep.
And second, we had to be very, very deliberate because it wasn't just going to happen by accident. There was, you have to have a Zoom call or a Teams call. You have to figure out how those things work, and you have to figure out how to lead those differently.
Yep.
So I think it forced us in many respects. You always look back on the challenges and you say, yeah, we actually got stronger as a result.
Sure. Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, who's been somebody you guys have admired over the course of your career? Who have you admired most?
You're up.
Well, I mean, I'd say my father for starters, and for two reasons: work ethic, and I would also say business acumen. My father's been fairly successful, and he still farms. He's 81, and he's about to start his 62nd crop.
Wow.
He just doesn't quit. So that persistence, work ethic, and I'll give him credit for the acumen. A couple other that I thought about, because this, I can think about, and this is maybe a longer term. Early in my career, even before my career, I think about Ronald Reagan as a great communicator. And that's the one thing that his ability to connect with an audience is something that's always sort of resonated with me, and it's always been something that's that's sort of stuck with me.
You bet.
If you're gonna be good at this leadership stuff, you've got to be a good communicator. So, and then another one, and this may be a bit off path for some, but Billy Graham.
Yeah.
And his was about purpose, his commitment to purpose, and then the stories over the years that I've read through, and how, in the ways he was kind of able to connect with even the obscure, and it was just because he stayed so dedicated to purpose. And those are three that sort of come to mind. There are many. There are many mentors, there are many individuals, but those are two that I thought just kind of over the top that have always sort of stuck with me.
Yeah, those are fantastic examples. Appreciate you sharing them. Those are good. I like that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Maybe I took it from, because I read a lot of biographies. The one that immediately jumped out from sort of history would, I think, be probably Abraham Lincoln. I mean, again, as a communicator, that sort of combination of humility and iron will, and the confidence to sort of lead quietly. I think many people have called me many things, but a quiet leader isn't one of them, right? But I absolutely recognize the value in it and admire it, and that recognizing that it's such a lesson for me that leadership can take so different forms, right? And you've got to be who you are, and I'm just sort of the loud, sort of outgoing guy in the room, but there are so many very, very strong leaders who are different, and I just his combination of that humility, iron will, and willingness to work with his rivals to solve problems are pretty impressive to me.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
And I love his sense of humor.
Yeah. I was just reading something the other day. I had never read this before about Lincoln, in that he was a wrestler.
I did not know that.
I didn't know this either, but he was quite competitive physically and apparently pretty dominant.
Wow.
So,
Yeah, there's.
Yeah.
I didn't know
Well,
that.
he had to wrestle with a lot too.
Yeah.
I mean, internally, externally.
Well, so whenever I look at leaders if he, he wound up in that office through a very interesting series of events, right? But then have to weather the storm that he went through, and keeping America together and going through all these things during that time frame. And I'm sure there's plenty of ways we can debate all that stuff, but it's to be able to just weather that storm, period. Okay? It takes guts to sit there when nothing is working, right? My situation has been nothing comparable on a level of magnitude, but there's some months where as a business owner, and you're sitting here thinking, okay, how are we making payroll? Where's it all coming from? I've had to negotiate with vendors, right? And say, hey, we're going to pay this next month. None of that's fun. you know. And there's nothing great about any of that, but as a leader, you have to be able to sit in that and to say, I decided to be here. This is, you know, and I'm going to, and we're going to get through it, and tell your team like, hey, we're going to get through this, and then be able to walk through that as long as it takes, through whatever it takes, you know, to get there. There is I have a deep respect for people that are doing that on a much grander scale than I ever will. You know, because nobody ever wants to disappoint. And this is actually, I think, one of the biggest barriers that particularly young leaders have, or those people I think about that you want to ascend into better performers as leaders in, say, locations or operations managers or whatever. You have to be okay with disappointing people.
Yeah, I can't remember where, because I'm a podcast fan, that somebody said, you know, there's all of us understand we can't make everybody happy all the time, but almost every one of us secretly believe that we're going to be the exception to that rule.
Yep.
Yeah.
Right? And it's just always incredibly disappointing to realize that, nope, in fact we are, and that the attempt to do that is a real problem.
Well, if you look at the generationally, you guys mentioned generations earlier. So I know for sure there's a generation of folks that are at least 40 and under, and maybe creeping up into the mid 40s a little bit, who were not raised with the expectation that you were going to have to let someone down, because nobody ever let us down. Right? So you now have two generations of people in the workforce where the dads were there for a lot of the sports games, right? Moms were there. There's a lot of support. There's a lot of opportunity to get involved in everything. And so as you look at that younger generation, there wasn't a lot of disappointment. So we're not predisposed, or they're not predisposed to having to now create that and say no. The answer automatically becomes yes, and let me figure it out. And then a lot of things get convoluted. Personal theory, I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole today, but you know, that's one of the things that I see come up a lot. So
yeah, I mean, I think that I think that's true. I mean, somebody once said, you know, right, the goal is you have two choices as a parent, and probably as a leader is very much the same way, because I think parenting and leading can be in some sense similar, right? You can either prepare your child for the road, or you can prepare the road for your child. And a lot of people today have grown up with their parents who have prepared the road for them.
That's
right?
a great way to
They
put
don't
it.
call them helicopter parents, they call them lawnmower parents, right? We're going to mow the lawn in front of them, and they can walk down that nice smooth grass, versus saying, hey, that road out there is really, really bumpy, and you need to have the skills to be able to overcome whatever's out in front of you.
Yep.
Right? And I think leadership is very much the same way. But it's not as fun to say, hey, suck it up, right? Sometimes we want to be able to help those guys. And managing that in an attitude of servant leadership is sort of that paradox of servant leadership is giving them the challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about, I want to actually jump down on our list here a little bit, guys, and talk about vulnerability and that, because I think this kind of segues perfectly into that, and then we'll go back and do a little speed round to finish up here. But how important is vulnerability in these conversations that you guys are having with your teams and their teams throughout the organization, and being able to create an intentional environment as much as you can here?
That may be the hardest thing to do. I mean, first of all, conceptually, if somebody if they haven't come to this on their own, it's really hard to convey, to understand. And when I said about making that transition from boss to leader, it's kind of the same thing. It is, I mean, it's paramount, because I think without understanding that, it's really hard to kind of make it to the next level as a leader. It's an important part of building trust. When I think about trust, for me, it's a lot of people think about trust as a simple thing. It's very complex, and complex. There's how you show up, what's your track record, what's your competency, how reliable are you. But then there's two other parts of that, and this is where I think the vulnerability comes in. There's this part about caring, and there's this part about openness or transparency.
Yep.
And I think you sort of have to be vulnerable in order to be able to connect with those two.
Yeah, I mean, I look at it, look, trust is the foundation of all of it. And in order to do that, you have to go first.
Yep.
right? Somebody has to say, okay, we're going to trust each other. You have to go first.
Yep.
And that means you have to expose yourself in some way, shape, or form, right? The real you. Because if all of us are very intuitive at some level and are going to pick up on something. So if that other person has that hard outer shell, it's like, well, hold on a second. What now? Maybe if they do, maybe I need to armor up. Going back to Brene Brown, I need to armor up and make sure I'm protected. But as a leader, you have to go first because by definition, you are the leader. There is a power imbalance, and if you don't go first, you cannot expect that out of your team.
Yep, absolutely. Does your military background play into your leadership style these days? I don't know how it could.
Yes, I mean, I always say, look, for me, it was the seminal sort of time in my life in terms of just coming out of college. I was passionate about leadership through college, and this, the U.S. Army is very intentional about leadership, and you get lots of examples, both good and bad, under incredibly stressful, operating environments.
Right.
So absolutely, unquestionably, it shows up both sometimes the good and the bad. But I would say the impression of how leadership works in the military. We think of Full Metal Jacket but the really good ones and the ones I saw when I was fortunate enough to work in some pretty elite units, the real ones they are vulnerable. They are leading. They're explaining the why. They are doing the strong leadership that we all practice or try to practice in the civilian world. They're doing it there too. Yeah. Because when you're operating under very, very stressful environments where a whole bunch of people's lives, it's not something that you want to say, you just do it because I told you to and it's an order. That usually is the very last step when every other thing has failed or you're simply out of time. That's not good. That's not where you want to be. Right. You don't want to start there. Right. But the impression of the military is that's where it starts. And no, that's what basic training starts. But that's your first 12 weeks. Yep. It's the rest of your career that's very different, hopefully. Yeah.
That's a really good way to look at it. I suppose there's a time and a place to say, get behind me, let's go. But there's a lot of preparation that comes in with all this too.
It really is. So, there needs to be.
Yeah, fascinating. Okay, let's go back to the top. So what book, podcast? We got a couple books sitting here on the table. I don't know if those are the recommended books for you guys, but what books, podcasts, what resources do you guys?
I mean, there's. I mean, you could just go on and on and on. I listen to Craig Groeschel's podcast, and the reason what I like about Craig's is Craig brings in other individuals. It's not, it's and there's lots of variety there. In my approach to books, I even hate to start, but Jeff brought in Brene Brown and Dare to Lead, and the thing I took away from that was being able to set boundaries or understanding to a certain degree things that I had done in the past were boundaries that I didn't understand. But when I talk about reading those books, for me it's always, what can I take from this book that becomes a part of my leadership style? Yeah. Instead of trying, because if you're not careful, what you can just sort of emulate the last book you read. And
that's a really good point.
And that's just drag everybody through these big swings. We're going to do this strategy because I read this cool book, and we're going to do this strategy because there's this new book. Yeah, that's a bad day for everybody.
I mean, there's a very big play in the industry right now that I'm wondering if that was the catalyst behind this very significant leadership change in this particular organization. And is that the reason? I mean, because there's a book behind it, and I understand, and I'm sure it's more well thought out in that case than this, but I see that a lot with individual leaders who will go and read Brene Brown today. Okay, now this whole month is about vulnerability, and the next month they read whatever the next book is, and it becomes, it's really easy to let one sway you a little bit too far.
So my advice would be to read for purpose, but also read for pleasure. And I'd say read for what you could glean or listen. Some folks are just podcasts, or you can you can listen to those when other times that you really can't read. But take from that and make it own what part of that really works for you.
Yeah, I like that. Great recommendation.
Yeah.
How about you, Jeff?
Yeah, no, I would say I was going to pull out my little podcast list. I should have done this before. But no, I would say leadership. Craig Groeschel's leadership podcast is really a great place for me. At the Table with Patrick Lencioni is another one. I gotta pull it up right now because I apologize. I'll have to go find my podcast here in a second. But
it's fine.
But I would say So I love podcasts because I think they're constantly, it's just something that I can listen to in the car or if I'm doing something else. Yeah, I mean, that's probably where I'd start. I think the reader, very similar. I'm a big reader. I mean, I read all the time. I find both inspiration. Somebody says, we read to know that we are not alone. I think leadership, if it's done right, at times it's going to be lonely. Some of the things that people don't like to talk about. You're going to disappoint people. Right. You're going to find yourself in challenging moments. You're going to have to make decisions where you are the person that is making the decision, and it's your job. But that doesn't mean it's easy to make the decision, or that you just sit with it and you go, "Oh, I made it, and everything's great, and it was perfect." No, I mean, we live in the gray, and so I think for me, reading to know that I'm not necessarily alone, and then you just pick up stuff. A lot of it for me. Like we're asking the leadership team right now to reread Good to Great. Many have read that book. It's a classic. But reading it now after being in this role, I read it completely different. I had our chief people officer sent me a note the other day and said, reading this now, 15 years later, in her role, she's just like, wow, it's just like I'm rereading it and I'm reading it for the first time. It just opens up a lot. So I think for me, I'm with Joey. I read it for inspiration, lessons that I've probably learned and forgotten, a new way to think about an old problem. Lots and lots of reasons. I don't think you can. My personal view is you can't read enough.
Yeah, I think you bring up an interesting point. I mean, we often move from one book to the next book, and obviously it takes more actual work to read a book than to sit down and watch a movie. Right. How many times have people rewatched Rocky? Right. As an example, and maybe multiple, maybe all 4 or 5 of them, right? Over the years, or whatever your favorite movie is. Some people like fighting movies, war movies, dramas, whatever. We rewatch those a lot, but we don't reread books a lot, which is an interesting point. We have our Thriving Leader program, which is our flagship work. I have guys that have now been through this thing 6 times. Right? And you think, are they slow learners? Are they not getting it? Like, if they went in January and they come back in August, well, if we made any progress, they should not be the same person in August that they were in January. They should have advanced in some skill sets and mindsets and things like that. And so now the work means something different. Yeah. Same as reading Good to Great again or anything else. Like, now it means something that it didn't mean before, because I've actually up-leveled my capabilities.
And I think we just see it from a new perspective, right? I mean,
exactly.
Just different roles or different experiences.
Yeah, I mean, of course, personally, I read scripture every day. I journal every day. I don't know how many times I've read through the Bible. It's different every time. And I'll say that with purpose, I read it more open. With purpose to be open. In other words, for me, it's like it's God out of the box, or God, you can read to put God in a box, or you can read to take God out of the box. I tend to read more to take it out of the box. And I'll say I read almost everything that way today. Thinking broader, not. Because it's real easy when we read to just kind of confine things down.
Right.
And most of the time, that is not the author's purpose.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to throw a random book out there just because I just thought of it. I can't believe I didn't put it out there. But Marcus Aurelius' Meditations.
Oh, yeah, those are great.
It's an absolutely fabulous book.
Yep.
I've read it now 3 times in the last year alone. It's not that long. That would be one I'd put on the list.
Good stuff. Awesome. Well, great recommendations. Glad you brought in scripture. It's such an important piece. One thing that's really shifted for me with that in more recent years is I'm starting to, there's just so much depth to everything. Everything means it's not just the words on the page. You can't just take it at surface value. But looking for ways to go back in the Old Testament to get the Hebrew translations where I can, or talk to somebody who can translate it to Hebrew, because as we read it in English is not necessarily all that's there, right? One of my favorite, it was about Abraham, being called to go off into the wilderness and, kind of go on his journey. And if we read it in English, it's very literal. You have to go on a journey to find yourself. But if you read it in the Hebrew, you have to go on an inward journey to find yourself, which happens either way. But just like that simple little interpretation added so much depth to that. because that's what I believe. I believe that leadership is an inward journey first before an outward journey. And so that just, and so that was the first one that I saw a couple years ago on that. And now I started going deep. I'm looking for other places, in Scripture that means something more than what we were raised to believe in Bible school or Sunday school or whatever the case may be. So, guys, let's just talk about productivity, energy improvement, those kind of things to bring it in for a landing here today. So what do you guys do to keep your energy up? What do you do to stay productive? Have at it.
I guess I'll go first. I think having that morning routine for me is really, really important. It consists of, some type of spiritual reading, some type of mindfulness, and exercise. In an ideal morning, I get all three before I get to work. Puts me in the right state from a physical perspective and a mental and a spiritual perspective.
You bet. Good. Does it have to happen by any certain time? Are you like a 5 a.m.er?
I tend to be a 5 a.m. In my world, it's a 5 a.m.
Yep.
And I just realized that you have to pay yourself first. It's just like your savings account. If you're trying to be a saver, you got to pay yourself first. You got to pay yourself first, because if I wait to the end of the day, I have, I got a workout bag in there that's got a lot of dust on the top of it because, the road of life is paved with good intention, and it just doesn't happen enough, consistently enough. And it took a significant physical scare. I had a heart attack at 43 years old, and I'm like, well, if I'm going to do this, and I love what I do, I better figure out how to manage the stress, because I like stressful environments. I better figure out how to take care of myself physically, and I got to do it differently.
Wow, that's young.
Yeah, it is.
Very young for that. Wow. What about you, Joey?
Prayer, meditation. I have to have my quiet time. I walk a fair amount, so quiet walks for me is kind of an important deal. But however you sort of regenerate, you just have to be able to rest and reboot. But probably the most important thing for me is purpose. That's how you get your energy back. You have to rest, you have to reload, but if you don't have that sense of purpose, it's hard to get your energy back up. So that's really important. Now, productivity, boy, this is a tough one for me. I literally hate routine, but I have to have it. I have to have the tools. I have to, I mentioned journaling.
Sure.
I use apps, the schedule, all of those things that, list. I have to have them, because those things do not come natural for me. They just don't. That's been a pointed sort of discovery. I'll add people to that.
Yep.
Is discovering situations where, if I get past a project to manage, it's probably not going to get done if I don't find someone to sort of help to do that.
Yep. Yeah. I'm in the exact same boat. My wife and I are studying some Dan Sullivan work right now with Strategic Coach, and so he's claim to fame has coached more entrepreneurs than any other in the coaching space, and I'm in the coaching space, and so I, as a potential competitor, I'm recommending his work. And but he wrote a book here in the last couple of years, one called Who Not How. Follow up to that was 10x is easier than 2x. And it's both are interesting, but the who not how really gets you looking at, what's the 20% of what you do that actually really moves the needle, and then who else can do the 80%, and who can you align with that actually can put you in a better position, that probably do that job better anyway, right? If it comes down to detail, I'm not the one on my team that ought to be doing it. But who loves it, who really gets off on the detail and can make that be 10 times better than I ever could, and actually enjoy it.
Yeah.
Right. So there's a lot to learn in those two books. 10x is easier than 2x was a big one for us, because it really called us into question to take a look at our goals and say, okay, your goals are here, but 10x really just means getting better people around you. It's not about doing more. And often,
there's just limits, right?
Most of us, I think, in leadership roles, we just look at how can I grind a little bit harder to get more, and it's the wrong question.
Well, I think one of the big things from my perspective is, early on in your career, you're an individual contributor. and your job is to do.
Yeah.
You do things, right? So you're if you're a welder, you're welding, and if you're whatever you're doing, right? If I'm a lawyer, I write, and I'm doing briefs. But as you move up in your career, you're leading teams and you're building teams, right? But early on in your career, success is usually defined by output, which is usually equal to hard work. And we got to where we go because we just worked really hard. Most of us say to ourselves, I may not be the smartest, but I can sure outwork everybody else.
Yep.
But as a leader, when you switch over to that other side of things, your success is not managed by how hard you work. It's not about output. It's about influence.
Yep.
And so you've got to figure out, how do I best influence the situation? And I go back to your question around productivity. From my perspective, one of the things I can do both on the positive side and the negative side of things is how I show up. If I show up and I'm in a crappy mood for whatever variety of reason, well, good luck to everybody else, right? And you can just see the whole room's just like, oh Lord, here we go, right? And that's it's just awful.
Yep.
It can be very, very counterproductive. So I think it's about helping leaders understand that how I measure success today as a leader is very different than how you measure success before. Because most of us just think, I just work harder. It's like, well, that's actually not going to get you any further. As a matter of fact, your influence, because you're being in a crappy mood, is going to go down.
Yep. Good. Well, guys, what's the last question of the day is what's something that you want to go to work on this year? What's the biggest thing you want to improve?
Where do I start?
I know it can be a long list, but
no, I mean it's not really that. It's probably not that difficult for me. So I brought a successor in, so probably mentoring her is I'd put that at number one. That's probably the most important thing, and then. For me, and I think this is just a constant challenge, is to understand how important it is for me to stay healthy. And that's spiritually, mentally, physically. And like Jeff said, we've been on a treadmill. It's been climbing like this. And for me, I'd say probably that is, I've probably not done the best over the last 3 years.
Sure.
With that. So I'd say that was probably priority number 2.
You bet. Good stuff. Thank you.
I think of the term for me as together. GreenPoint's is sort of an interesting organization in that we are half wholesale to our co-ops, who are both our customers and our owners.
Right.
And then we also have close to 90 direct retail-owned stores. And so we sell directly to growers. And when I think about technology and I think about logistics and I think about how we can function as an organization, go forward and grow, continue to grow at scale, how do we do that together? What does together look like? How do you give those local areas and those co-ops, they want autonomy. The co-ops are going to have autonomy. How do we give our retail groups autonomy, but also operate together as a single entity?
Sure.
And particularly in light of what's coming down the pike with AI, we have to figure this game out. So from my perspective is, how do I as a leader help us understand the larger vision of, in my opinion, that together is going to be more important than ever going forward.
Yep.
Because we need to be able to leverage that technology, and you just can't do it separately.
Yeah. Wow. You guys got some jobs ahead of you this year. It's a little bit to swallow, but gentlemen, thank you for doing this interview, for letting me come down here, hang out you, come to see your place a little bit, and get my first, my inaugural trip to Alabama. I hope there's more.
I hope it's not your last.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a good trip. Thanks for being on the show.
Absolutely. Welcome. Glad to be here.